Santanu Dey, a wonderful scholar from Ramakrishna Math College, Belur. Vaishnava ritual manuals and Reformist voices within Bengali Vaishnavism in Colonial Bengal. Actually, we are keeping our great Professor Ramanji waiting to give his special invited talk. Immediately after Chantanuji's paper presentation, we'll have a wonderful scholarly talk by Professor V. Raman.
ধন্যবাদ প্রফেসর নাগরাজজি। আজকে আমার এখানে এসে সত্যি খুব ভালো লাগছে। ইনফ্যাক্ট আমার দক্ষিণ ভারতে আসা আগে সুযোগ হয়নি। এই কনফারেন্সের খাতিরে আজকে আমি আসতে পেরে সত্যি কৃতজ্ঞ। নাগরাজজিকে তো অবশ্যই জানাই, এবং তার সাথে সাথে আমি শ্রীনিবাসজি এবং আরো অন্যান্যরা যাদের সঙ্গে আগে অন্যান্য ইন্ডিকা কনফারেন্সে দেখা হয়েছে তাদেরকেও আমি আমার কৃতজ্ঞতা জানাই। So that was basically in my mother tongue, as was expected from me. The paper which I am supposed to speak on is not actually a paper so called, it's just my ruminations, and basically it's a work in progress. So I don't think that there would be any conclusions to draw from. There would be more questions which can crop up from that. So if I may just move on. Just and I must also qualify before I begin that this is basically something about the Vaishnava manuals as well as on the periodicals of 20th and the 19th century, and the way in which Vaishnavism in Bengal, especially which is known as Gauriya Vaishnavism or even qualified as Bengali Vaishnavism by some, was trying to reframe itself, trying to refigure itself and reform itself to a certain extent. The ways in which such voices came up in the 19th and 20th century is what is more interesting. But again, I would qualify that this is a broad sweep. My entire discussion would be framed around the rituals and the ritual practices, and also about how Guru worship and other kinds of such practices were re-looked at by colonialists and colonial Bengalis who went through the education system of colonial Bengal. So this with this proviso, let me just go in, and as we understand, this is part of a broader project which I am supposed to do, or rather just beginning to do, with the Indian Knowledge Systems, IKS, and the way in which Indian traditions have been looked at by Western categories, or rather within, or rather through Western categories by Westerners, and whether we can think out of this epistemological box and rethink certain categories which can be more fruitful from an Indic perspective. That is what is the end in mind before we delve into the topic. So this is part of a ritual studies aspect, what I'm going to look at. And ritual studies, as we understand, is not a new area. It is an area which has been going on in the West for quite some time, and it is not just restricted even within religious rituals. It covers a very broad range of categories. Ritual studies began from the 1960s onward in the West, and then it moved on in various directions, and it has also influenced Indian traditions to a certain extent. The way in which Indian scholars, or rather Western scholars who have been working on India, have looked at it, have also filtered Indian traditions through those dimensions. So there's a recent scholar whom you can just see, Axel Michels, who works in Germany, He has written a book which is on Homo Ritualis, Hindu ritual and its significance for ritual theory. And this is one of those which tries to give a certain kind of definition for the Indian ritual structures. And it is considered that if we understand the ritual core of a particular tradition, then we would be in a position to understand the way in which the grammar, just like in a language, how the grammar works, the rituals constitute the blocks through which a particular tradition is created. So, ritual manuals are one of those areas which are key to the practice of a tradition, and so these are important. Now, in the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, and in northern India, especially in the Brajbhumi, as some of the presenters spoke about, the Sunil and others, we have already listened to how the Gaudiya tradition was growing in Vrindavan through the help of the Sara Goswamis or the 6 Goswamis who had been instituted, or rather they had been sent by Chaitanya in order to compile and collate a certain kind of theological basis for the religion. And forgive me, I'm using words like religion and all, which are usually not to be used in such categorizations. So these traditions have been filtered through, and they have been understood in various ways. The Hari Bhakti Vilas is one of those texts which are key texts for the ritual understanding of the Chaitanya Vaishnava tradition. And this particular work, which was written by Sanatana Goswami, it draws upon obviously a long tradition of other works in different parts of India. I won't be going into the details as to how it drew its components, but what is important is that he tries to give out an authoritative position on what actually is Vaishnava ritual, or rather what kinds of rituals are important. And since the project which I am involved in now is comparative in its nature, it not just looks at the Chaitanya Vaishnava tradition, but also my co-PI would be also looking at the Vallabhacharya tradition. So these traditions, how they are structured, how sampradayas are structured, and how they evolve over time, these are issues which are key to an understanding of this particular venture. Now, I won't be going into too much detail, but anyway, I'll just relate certain aspects of the Hari Bhakti Vilas. It is a huge compendium which has numerous aspects covered, right from how to worship the deity, how to identify the Guru, how to do daily worship issues. Everything is explained in a very elaborate manner. In around 20 chapters it is done. So the Hari Bhakti Vilas, which was compiled around 1540 after the passing away of Chaitanya. Chaitanya, as we all know, lived between 1486 and 1533. But this particular text, which was written in Braj, and then it was circulated in different parts of eastern India as well, was one of those influences which came to Bengal and tried to shape up, the mold, the ritual tradition in the Bengali Vaishnava tradition. It has different aspects to it, but I'll just dwell on just one topic without going into the details. Chapter 1 of this particular text looks at initiation and diksha, and who is qualified to receive it, who is not qualified to receive it, what are the qualities of a guru that one has to identify before identifying or associating with him, how long does he have to stay with him. All these are discussed in great detail by the author. Now, why I am stressing on this is that when we come to the colonial period, let me just move on a bit. During the colonial period, we find that this issue of who is qualified to be a good guru, Sadguru, and who is not, who is a fake guru, becomes very important. So when I was working earlier and looking at only the colonial texts, it was as if that this was the only issue which was being staked up. But if you look at the earlier sources, as in the early medieval, or not the early medieval, early modern sources, then you can identify that these questions have a genealogy of their own. And these questions go back in time, and these can crop up in various shapes at different points of time. So the specific characteristics of a guru which is discussed in the Hari Bhakti Vilas mentions several qualifiers. One of them being that one has to be of pure descent. He should be pure, not just in his own personality and his own nature and behavior, but also belong to a particular kind of caste or family system. He should be free from anger, and all the others which are written over here, I won't repeat that. But this is important to note that you have an entire list of qualifiers through which the guru is to be identified and he is to be associated with. And you have numerous quotations being given or cited from other traditions prior to the writing of the Hari Bhakti Vilas, which are included in order to affirm the identity of this particular text. So, who may be a guru is something which is dealt with in great detail, but there is another thing which is also looked at, that who is a non-guru, who should not be considered as one's guru and who should be avoided. So, somebody who is a glutton, one who eats too much is to be avoided. And there are many other qualifiers, but I stress on this point gluttony because in the 19th century, if you look at the Bengali texts which are written across the length and breadth of Bengal, especially in Kolkata, these texts, the farcical texts, they harp on this idea of Vaishnava gluttony and the deviations. For example, they mention about the they mention about the meat-eating Vaishnavas. They mention about the alcohol-drinking Vaishnavas. So these are issues which are deliberately done in order to poke fun at the Vaishnavas, and they are done with an intent to create some kind of differential opinion about them. Now, if we look at the regional variations of how this tradition, the Gaudiya tradition, was being shaped up in Bengal, then, okay, if we look at that, then we find that in Bengal, the Hari Bhakti Vilas was not as if that it was an immensely popular, immensely important text that it had become. There were various other texts also which were important, and as the Hari Bhakti Vilas, when it was written, the idea of Chaitanya worship has still not arrived, at least at Braj, so we do not find any mention about it. But in Bengal, the Pancharatra tradition, the Panchatatva tradition, which identifies the 5 people who are the important personalities of this particular tradition, they were worshipped, and they were also given a particular deification within the system. We find that in Navadvip, Chaitanya's second wife, Vishnupriya, was also worshipped, and murtis were established of her, as well as dual murtis of Vishnupriya as well as Chaitanya being established in different parts of Bengal. Now, in Bengal, there were also other texts which were written, which tried to veer away from the Hari Bhakti Vilas. The Bhavana Sara Samagraha, the Gauranga Govindachana Smarana Paddhati, and the Sadhanamrita Chandrika. These are certain texts. I'm not going to cite anything from it because still it is in progress, but we find that several kinds of variations of worship and worship patterns can be noticed in terms of this particular tradition in Bengal. Now, the Gaudiya Sampradaya, as it developed in Bengal, had its own variations. We find that the Goswamis, who were, for example, at Shantipur, we have Advaita, the tradition, Advaita tradition as in Advaita Acharya, who was an associate of Chaitanya. He had his own genealogy and family tradition. A lineage was established over there. There was also the Nityananda tradition, as we just heard from Sunil. The Nityananda tradition was very varied, and there were several tendencies within it which tried to spread this religion in further ways, not just within the Bengalis, but also within the Buddhists who were there at that time. The Naranaries were one category of the social segment who were converted by Virabhadra, who was the son of Nityananda. So we have this as well. But apart from the Goswami tradition, we have another segment who considered themselves to be Vaishnavas, but they had their own kinds of worship patterns. The Akra-based Vaishnavas, the Bairagis and the Babajis, who were trying to worship in their own way. And finally, I'll just take 2 minutes. And finally, we also have certain Creole kinds of bhakti-oriented sects, which were mainly cults of a certain order, like the Karta Bhajas or the Shahib Dhanis, and there were numerous, and works have been done on that as well. So what I couldn't arrive at what I was actually planning to say. This is just the preview. The main area is basically regarding how the Chaitanya tradition was refiltered and looked at in a different manner by the 19th century colonialists. We have the tradition being stereotyped. It is being portrayed in a format which is considered as immoral, and it is also stereotyped, and the Guru worship and the Guru parampara is also criticized by many of the scholars at that time. Scholars as in single inverted quotes. We also have ethnographic information which is being given by the census observers, and they also present an extremely stereotyped notion about these segments. So, in fact, Chaitanya himself is portrayed as a God-obsessed lunatic, and the worshippers are also considered to be a servile form, or they are in a pattern which is a servile form of worship towards a guru. So the guru becomes a extremely stereotyped figure in the colonial context. And what happens is that the Vaishnava manuals as well as the Vaishnava periodicals, which come up in the late 19th and early 20th century, they try to contest this notion, they try to go beyond this notion, and they try to inculcate a new order. A reformist voice comes from within the community, and this is what becomes very important in shaping the way Vaishnavism evolved, Bengali Vaishnavism evolved in the present period. So there were various norms of behavior which were considered to be proper, quote unquote proper, and in fact people from the 19th century harked back, they looked back towards the Hari Bhakti Vilas and other texts which they tried to bring in a major way in the colonial period. So we have various articles being written, and I think you would have a glimpse of it in the paper that may be published later on. So you have Sri Gaudharmir Sharbotkoshrata, which is the identification of Gaudiya Vaishnavism as the best among the lot, among the traditions which are available. And we also have certain features which are now being emphasized. For example, we find that Shotru Prati Prem, that is love towards one's enemy. So even if he is an enemy, you shouldn't shun him. You should embrace him and try to accommodate him within your fold. These are concepts, or these are traditions which are now being mentioned, and these are features which are now being incorporated by the 19th and the early 20th century scholars. So this is one. But there was also another aspect about rejuvenating sites of Vaishnavism. In fact, the Shripats, which were present in various parts of Bengal, these were not just identified, some of them had been dilapidated by the 19th and the 20th century. These were rebuilt And in certain cases, we also find new associations being established. For example, Mayapur in Navadvip is being identified by a person, just like Jagannath stated about a certain personality in the south. In fact, we have Kedarnath Datta Bhaktivinoda Thakur. He tries to rejuvenate this particular site in around 1894. He identifies it. He writes about it. In fact, he wrote a book which is called the Navadvip Dhamma Mahatmya. And on the basis of this, he tries to create a new force behind the identification of places. Vaishnava rituals and practices were also, I'm sorry to have taken more time than was required, but you also have Vaishnava rituals and practices being brought in a very broad format. We have the identification of daimya, saralata, that is innocence, truthfulness, satyastrayata, and shamadarshitva. These were, and there were others also, which were emphasized on as the main characterizing features of Vaishnava Bhakti in Bengal. Not just sites and personalities, even images. And these images, as we know, that the coming in of the press in the 19th century enabled the colonial reformers from a very, they were able to rebuild their religion in a major way. So this is one such, which is from the Chorbagan studio. This is a chromolithograph which had come out in around 1874, and there are various others also which were important for giving out an imagery of Vaishnava resurgence towards the people as well. This is a basic, and this is a very basic list of the numerous manuals that you have being written in the 19th and early 20th century, most of them in the early 20th century, which tried to propagate their own versions of the correct procedure of worship. Vaishnava practices, Vaishnava rituals were considered to be important, and that is why you have these being published in numerous quantities. In fact, some of them mention that almost 1 lakh productions were made, and this is from the statements which have been given to us by them. One of these among the entire lot is by Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati, who went on to establish the Gaudiya Mutt in Bengal, and later on around 64 mutts were established in different parts of India, including in Rangoon, and one in Berlin and the other in London during the 1930s. So this is one phase of activity which was popularized by them. But I don't want to hedge my entire discussion only around Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati. There were various other attempts also which were parallelly taking place. I'll just wait. So this is one more text, the Pravartak Digir Shri Vigraha Sheva Pranali, which is the exposition of the sanctioned way of idol worship, which was meant for the initiates. This is by a person called Priyanath Nandi. He was actually a doctor, but he was induced by Bhakti, and he came in contact with several other important luminaries of the day and tried to propagate his own brand, if we may use this word, own version of the Vaishnava Bhakti among the people. Devitya Sampatti, this is a word which is again a very important area which one needs to keep in mind, because lands which had been granted to religious seminaries and religious institutions, the way in which it was being used, whether it was being used properly or not, is something which came in for discussion. And in fact, the particular topic which was mentioned dealt with it in a very strong-handed manner. In fact, the religious classes who had been using these lands for their own benefit, they were also chastised in certain cases. In fact, they also tried to state, last slide, 1/8 of the annual income was to be kept apart for different kinds of activities which are more or less welfare oriented. So these are things which were deliberately brought in and discussed under these. So this is basically not something where we should actually leave off, but this is where I am forced to, because the conclusions won't come. This raises questions regarding how Sampradayas from its medieval moorings, early modern moorings, they come into the modern period, and the ways in which different kinds of traditional practices, the Sampradaya practices, change over time. This is something which should be looked at in greater detail, perhaps by everyone, because we tend to stress more on the theological and tend to stress more on the philosophical aspects rather than the ritual aspects. This is also one very important segment of our understanding of particular traditions. So this is where I'll leave off. Thank you so much for your patient listening, and I'm hopefully you would get to listen to a more robust paper when I've been able to look at it in greater detail. Thank you so much.